I'll be reading Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God.
Good morning. Howdy, church. Well, this week was surprisingly long for me. And all it was having a 1-year-old birthday party. And it made me realize there's really 2 milestones. I told Jerry this morning, we kept them alive for a year, and then we kept them alive through the party, which was way harder. He almost flew off the slide a couple times, got kicked off, whatever you want to say. That's not the reason that we have a short sermon this morning. I'm sure it plays a part in it somewhere. But I had a thought in my head that I couldn't get out of my head, that is. And I want to share it with you from Scripture. Before we do that, I want to thank everyone for being here today. If you've made a commitment to bring yourself or your family every week, that's a big deal. And it's not just sitting in a pew. It's not just numbers. It's that there are people around you that need you. And thank you for being here and building them up and being built up and growing along with everybody. And if you're visiting, we're thankful to have you as well. We know that Scripture teaches that all things work together for good for them that love God. All things work together for them that love God. Yet on a day-to-day basis, how many of us can relate to feeling lost for meaning, feeling purposeless at times, or even depressed? We may go home after a long, hard day at whatever it is we do with our time and wonder or ask, can God really use that? Can God use that? Or more specifically, can God really, in His kingdom, for His purpose, for the good of what He has planned out, use realtors and teachers, umpires and chemists, cooks and lawyers, stay-at-home wives and stay-at-home mothers and husbands and fathers, I didn't want to get in trouble. I realized it wasn't in my notes. Dental assistants and project managers, mechanics, farmers, auditors and adjusters, secretaries and youth ministers. That's Matt and Alicia. Managers and laborers, handymen, baristas. Is there really anything God can do with those categories? And then we are tasked to read the stories in this book, Scripture. And we read stories of apostles and prophets and priests and kings. And we might feel less than. Or you might feel like, or you might ask yourself, is God really done doing big things? I mean, I know He's not going to turn this church into a church full of apostles and prophets. But is He done using you? Is He done using ordinary people? So we have to ask ourselves, do we really believe that Scripture we started off with? Make sure we know it. All things, you say it, work together for good For those who love God. All things work together for, hey, y'all are getting quiet, for good, for those who love God. You really took the wind out of that, guys. Come on. Do you believe it? That's always what's that question when it doesn't need an answer? Yeah, hypothetical. That's where we were going. If you believe that, you have to believe that God can use you exactly where you are. If you believe that, at the very least, you have to consider maybe God is preparing you for something. And you might not even know what it is yet. Because the more you think about the stories that we read about prophets and apostles, priests and kings, you will realize, and notice carefully, God doesn't call prophets and apostles, priests and kings. Think about it. God didn't call King David. Who'd he call? Shepherd David. God didn't call Prophet Amos. Who'd he call? Farmer Amos. God didn't call Apostle Peter. He called Fisherman Peter. God didn't call Priest Aaron. He called Big Brother Aaron. Let's look at Exodus 3, 1 through 3. Hoyt read it for us a moment ago, but we're going to read it one more time. Exodus 3, 1 through 3. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not yet consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Did you notice how it started, though? Now Moses was pasturing the flock. That's what Moses was doing with this time. Moses was not yet leading the people out of Egypt and through the wilderness and towards the promised land. He wasn't doing any of that yet. He was taking care of sheep. As Moses spent his days with sweat on his brows and the smell of cattle on his hands, it seems like nothing could have prepared him for the fact that he'd be up on a mountain one day receiving God's law, leading Israelites through walls of water, talking to God with his own mouth and hearing God's voice with his own ears and seeing a glimpse of God's glory with his own eyes. When God came to him in the burning bush, it's very clear, if you keep reading, Moses didn't feel prepared. Excuse after excuse after excuse. He wasn't eloquent. He felt like a nobody. He didn't consider himself spiritual enough. He said, who do I even tell him sent me? I don't even know your name. But God was preparing him all along, equipping Moses for Moses' calling. It's interesting. I love looking at how God uses specifically shepherds in Scripture. Like God loved Abel. God loved David. God loved Moses. Many of the prophets were shepherds also. Now look at Amos chapter 7 and verses 14 and 15. 7 chapters into his book, here's what Amos says. I am not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet, for I am a herdsman and grower of sycamore figs. Now, in the King's Chronicles Samuel section of Scripture, there's this term that's used that's sometimes translated as the school of the prophets. And we don't know a lot about it other than that maybe there was prophet school, that they went to school and they passed things on. But Amos makes it clear he didn't go to prophet school. My daddy wasn't a prophet. That's not the trade that I picked up. I am a herdsman and a farmer of sycamore figs. A sycamore farmer? Does God have a place for a sycamore farmer in the kingdom? Amos didn't know that every time he pruned a tree, God was preparing him to prune the bad branches off of Israel. That's what he does in his book. If Amos kept the law, he didn't know that every time he harvested and left a little bit behind for the poor, that he was practicing the justice and the mercy that he would be preaching to Israel in the book. The justice and mercy that he would later urge Israel to follow. There's also one in Mark 1, 16 and 17. Peter and Andrew are on a boat. They're doing their job. They're fishermen. They're casting their nets. And Jesus says, hey, you fishermen, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Right? I hope we see the theme. When God came to Moses, he was a shepherd. When God came to Amos, he was a farmer. When God came to Peter and Andrew, literally, they were fishermen. And God was preparing them all along for his purpose. Peter and Andrew, when casting their nets, were unaware that every long night and every unweathered storm was preparing them for a greater calling. They didn't go to rabbi school. They were often dismissed, even in the New Testament, as uneducated Galileans. How could these guys know anything? They weren't smart enough to make it to get picked up by a rabbi. They were stuck on boats. How did they end up here? But it's very clear God was writing a different story with their lives. Because of all this, God calls all of us to be faithful in our everyday lives. The lot that God has given you, that's where you need to be faithful. Faithfulness in the little. Luke 16:10, in kind of a bigger parable. It's really interesting. But it says this line, whoever is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. Whoever is very faithful, or who is faithful in very little, is also faithful in much. God honors faithfulness in the small tasks. Or maybe you could think about the one-talent man. What goes along with this is equipping the called. I was telling Matt about this sermon Matt said, and we've both heard it before, but it was really relevant. God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. God is preparing you for the thing that he's prepared you for. 1 Corinthians 1, 26 through 29 says something like this. Paul is writing to the Corinthian church, and he says, here you are, the church, supposed to be doing God's purpose, and you know what? None of you are especially qualified to do so. None of you are geniuses. That's saying it lightly. He calls them fools. He calls them weak. But he wanted it to be clear that God can and does use the foolish and the weak. Means there's hope for all of us. Remember, your work is important, And it's important to be faithful because you may not know exactly what God is preparing you for. Think about the life of Jesus. Jesus' own work didn't feel very special for a long time. That's amazing to say about the Son of God. For 30 years, nobody knew that this guy was special. Not nobody, but most people didn't know. The people often said, "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't this Mary and Joseph's boy?" And what's the point of all that? If God can use a carpenter from Galilee to save the world, He can use anybody from any walk of life to change the world. Or if you're thinking about people whose story got changed around, isn't it pretty wild to think about the Apostle Paul going around, Hebrew of Hebrews, Pharisee of Pharisees, murdering the church? Then God uses him to go preach the message to the Gentiles. And so the sermon is yours. Here's the summary. God is calling everyday people, always has. He is calling them to be faithful in their everyday lives. Our everyday work may be about something bigger. Jesus is our humble King. He's calling everyday people, and He's calling you. If you will accept His call, if you want to put Christ on in baptism, or you need the prayers of the church, would you come as we stand and as we sing?